So we've talked about describing player experiences. But what about describing games and the game experiences, the mechanics or the patterns that actually help us to create these player experiences? How do we describe those? So let's just do a little recap. So we have different parts of the experience. So for the game experience, player activity, and the player experience. And what we're talking about here is describing the first one there, the game experience. Again, we looked at this earlier before, just a visual description there. We've got our player experience, player activity, game experience. And we can consider that to be like MDA. So the game experience there is mechanics, player activity, dynamics, player experience is the aesthetics. And again, the game is made up of many different experiences or patterns. And each of those will create a particular player experience or set of player experiences. Now, let's think about this. So we have game experience X. So we had just up here before game experience 1, 2, game experience 3. So when we talk about the game experiences that create our player experiences, we're talking about the game elements in a specific configuration. So I've sort of put a visual representation here, different sort of elements there and their relationships with each other, creating a particular player experience. Let's think about these game elements. What are we talking about? Well, they include art, assets, 3D models, textures, animations, sounds, etc. Story assets as well. So you might have the main story, arc, character, backstories, etc. And also code. So we have our game engine, which is made of code, programming code. We might be using C++ or C#. We might be using visual scripts. We also have shaders, etc., different classes, etc., etc. So all of those are included under our game elements. Now, there's a concept of a game actor, which is a collection of game elements that perform a specific game function. Now, these can include, as examples, say a player character, for instance, or a non-player character, a pickup, a puzzle. Each of these can be considered to be what we call a game actor. Now, don't confuse this if you're familiar with Unreal Engine of an actor class. This is not the same thing. This is a conceptual object. So as I said here, so some things about game actors. Well, they are conceptual identities. They're identities that really only exist on paper or in our minds. They don't necessarily exist in the game world. Game actors are the building blocks of video games, so conceptual building blocks of video games, and they help us to visualize and create our games. They are comprised of game elements and or other game actors as well, so they are a composite object. Game actors have relationships and interact with other game actors. Game actors help us to understand how games are constructed. They help us in designing and building new games, and also allow us to conceptualize our game in both a micro and macro level. So this idea of game actors is actually quite powerful and quite important for us. So example, player character. If you have looked at the player characters in the first or third template, Unreal Engine template levels, you will have seen the player character. They are made up from different game elements. So an animated mesh, which itself is made up of a 3D mesh, a skeleton, and animations that have been applied to that skeleton. The player character also contains textures and shaders, as well as sounds, and a character controller that allows the player, to actually control that character. Another example is a puzzle. So we're talking about a game actor here, remember. So a puzzle could be made up from something like a locked door, a puzzle mechanism that needs specific items hidden in the game world. So that could be a puzzle lock where you need to find the different parts of the lock, or it could be a fuse box where you need to find the different fuses so you can have some sort of puzzle mechanism. Or it could be, say, a set of numbers that you need to get in the correct order. It could also include a set of pickups hidden throughout the game world. Now you'll notice each of these elements of our puzzle could also be considered to be game actors in their own right. So this is what I mean when I say that game actors can contain other game actors. Now again, this is conceptual, so we're looking at this, even though they exist there, the conceptual idea is something that exists to help us in our design process. Now, representing the game itself, we can represent a game at the highest level using the following game actors and elements. So we have an avatar. So the avatar is like our player character, basically, in Unreal. We also have the game world, again, which is an actor. Game characters, which are characters other than the avatar. And also the story, which isn't a game actor, and aesthetics as well, which is also not exactly a game actor. They're kind of special elements there. We can represent it visually in this way, where we have our player on the left-hand side, the player's experience. Then we have the actors there, so we have the avatar, we have the game characters and the game world. And you'll notice story and aesthetics. Aesthetics sitting there acting in a way that are like lenses to the game. Now, there's a special reason for that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. We also need to consider, very importantly, the relationships between all the actors. So we have the relationship between the player and the avatar. And in fact, in 3D, first person and third person games, the avatar moderates the interaction, or all the interactions from the player happen through the avatar. So we also have a relationship between the avatar and the game characters that you can see there. We have a relationship between the avatar and the game world. And then we also have a relationship between the game characters and the game world there. So, as I said before, all relationships with the player to other elements of the game are mediated by the avatar. Now, story and aesthetics. Why are story and aesthetics represented differently? Well, a first-person survival game could take place in a modern dystopian world. So if we think about Rust, for instance, you can think about how it works. All the art assets, all the textures, etc., fit for this sort of modern dystopian type world, which is what Rust actually is. But if you think about it, you could completely reskin a game like Rust, or really any game, and set it in some different type of world. So say a prehistoric world, in which case you might end up with something more like Ark. In this case, the story and the aesthetics would be completely different, while the game actors and their interactions would remain the same. So the reason we have story and aesthetics separately is because the mechanics really can be separated out. In reality, again, this is sort of something conceptual. In reality, the art assets and the story exist intertwined within the actors. But conceptually, we can remove story and aesthetics from those actors as well. Okay, so we've talked about player experiences and so how we describe player experiences and how we describe the game elements. The final thing I'm going to talk about here, this is sort of, I guess, the next step. It's probably a little bit beyond what we're going into, but a player experience design patterns. Just going to talk about what they are and how they fit. So essentially, player experience design patterns connect the subjective response of the player, what we call the player experience, or you might call the aesthetics in the MDA model, with the game elements and their configuration or their pattern described by the game experience or the game pattern or the game design pattern. They're found within existing games. They're extracted through the analysis of these games and are documented using the tools we've described. They can then be used to facilitate the design of new games. So that's, I've got a couple of other slides, but I don't think I really want to go into, we're not going to go into all of that. I just wanted to talk about those different things. So we've talked about the player experiences, what an experience is and how it works, the three different elements to experience. And there is that sort of MDA where we have the player's experience, the dynamics, and the mechanics. We talked about how we actually describe the player experience. We've talked about how we describe the mechanics, the game experience or the game pattern. using things like actors. And we can use all these in creating what we call player experience design patterns, which we can then use in the design of new games, which is a little bit, that's kind of where we're getting up to, but it's a little bit beyond, I guess, where we're going to get to this semester. All right, we'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next week.